The dust devil twisted across the cracked asphalt like nature's own funeral procession, carrying with it the dreams Jake Thompson had buried 6 months ago along with his cattle ranch. He sat behind the wheel of his rusted Ford pickup, staring at the weathered sign that read Millfield Population Zero, with the kind of bitter irony that had become his constant companion. In his shirt pocket, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear the paper apart, was a deed to 12 abandoned buildings, 43 acres of Nevada wasteland, and what the county clerk had cheerfully described as unlimited potential. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He'd paid $105 for it all. Everything he had left after the lawyers finished picking over the carcass of his Montana life. The silence stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken window frames and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. This was supposed to be his fresh start, his chance to prove that Jake Thompson wasn't finished, wasn't beaten, wasn't the failure that Danny Morrison had made him out to be when he'd forged Jake's signature on those loan documents. But sitting here now, looking at the sun-bleached skeleton of what had once been someone else's dream, Jake wondered if he'd simply traded one kind of grave for another. The town spread before him like a fever dream of the Old West, buildings leaning against each other for support like drunks stumbling home after last call. The general store's false front had partially collapsed, revealing the honest framework beneath years of pretense. The saloon's batwing doors hung at impossible angles, one hinge surrendering completely to gravity and time. Even the church, which should have offered some comfort or hope, stood with its steeple tilted at an angle that suggested God had long since looked elsewhere for more promising real estate. Jake killed the engine and stepped out into air so dry it seemed to steal moisture from his lungs with every breath. The heat hit him like a physical blow, the kind of punishing desert sun that made Montana winters seem like a gentle caress by comparison. He was 38 years old, a decorated Army veteran who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, a man who had built a successful cattle operation from nothing but determination and dawn-to-dusk work ethic. Yet standing here in the ruins of someone else's failed ambitions, he felt older than the ghost town itself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd come to Nevada to escape ghosts, only to buy a town full of them. The phantoms of his failed marriage haunted him just as surely as whatever spirits might linger in Millfield's abandoned buildings. Sarah had taken Emma and moved back to California, claiming she couldn't watch him destroy himself over a business that was already dead. The divorce papers had arrived on the same day the bank came to repossess his cattle, as if the universe had decided to compound his misery with clockwork precision. Emma was the only good thing left from that wreckage. At 16, his daughter possessed a fierce loyalty that reminded him uncomfortably of himself at that age, back when he still believed that hard work and honest dealing were enough to guarantee success. She'd insisted on coming with him to Nevada for the summer, despite her mother's objections and his own reservations about exposing her to what might turn out to be his final failure. She was back in Silver Ridge now, the nearest functioning town, staying with Tom Bradley's family while Jake assessed their new acquisition. Tom was the local sheriff, a man whose easy smile and genuine warmth had been the first kindness Jake had encountered since crossing into Nevada. Bradley had actually laughed when Jake told him about buying Millfield, not with mockery but with the kind of appreciative humor reserved for either the very brave or the completely insane. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that almost made the desolation beautiful. Jake pulled his gear from the truck bed, everything he owned fitting easily into 2 duffel bags and a toolbox. The plan, such as it was, involved sleeping in the truck tonight and spending tomorrow surveying the damage to see what, if anything, could be salvaged from his $105 investment. He'd studied the county records with the obsessive attention to detail that had made him a good soldier and, briefly, a successful rancher. Millfield had been established in 1952 when prospectors found a vein of silver that ran deep enough to support a community of nearly 300 people. The mine had played out by 1967, and the exodus had been swift and complete. One by one, families packed up their dreams and pointed their trucks toward more promising horizons, until only empty buildings remained to mark where hope had once flourished. The general store seemed the most structurally sound of the buildings, its thick stone foundation and solid timber frame having weathered the decades better than the others. Jake approached it cautiously, testing the front steps before committing his full weight to wood that might have become more suggestion than substance. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. He pushed it open and was greeted by the musty smell of abandonment and the peculiar silence that seemed to accumulate in places where human voices had been absent for too long. Inside, the store was a museum of interrupted lives. Shelves still held goods that had been left behind in the rush to leave, canned tomatoes with labels faded to illegibility, boxes of soap powder turned to concrete by decades of moisture and neglect. The cash register sat open, its empty drawer, a final testimony to the thoroughness of the town's abandonment. Jake moved through the space with the careful attention of an archaeologist, noting the mouse nests in corners and the way desert wind had sculpted small dunes of sand against the interior walls. It was then he noticed something that made him pause. The layer of dust that coated everything else seemed notably absent from a small area near the back counter. Not cleaned exactly, but disturbed in a way that suggested something more recent than the gradual accumulation of abandonment. He knelt and examined the floor more carefully, finding what appeared to be footprints in the fine desert sand that had infiltrated the building. Small prints, made by someone wearing soft-soled shoes or boots. Jake straightened slowly, suddenly aware that the oppressive silence around him might not be complete after all. He listened intently, straining to detect any sound that didn't belong to wind and settling wood. Nothing. Yet something about the quality of that nothing felt different now, charged with the possibility that he might not be as alone as he'd assumed. Moving more carefully, he explored the rest of the ground floor, finding evidence of the same subtle disturbance in several locations. In the back room that had presumably served as storage, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken. A blanket, clearly old but not ancient, folded neatly in a corner beside what appeared to be a small cache of canned goods. The labels on these cans were faded but readable, dating them to perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, rather than the decades-old merchandise on the front shelves. Someone had been living here, maybe still was. Jake's military training kicked in. Automatically, his senses sharpening as he processed this new information. The arrangement suggested temporary occupation rather than permanent residence. Someone who used the building occasionally rather than inhabiting it full-time. A drifter. Perhaps, or someone from Silver Ridge who used the ghost town as a hunting camp or retreat. The careful way the blanket had been folded and the organized arrangement of supplies suggested someone who respected the space, who saw themselves as a temporary caretaker rather than a squatter. The discovery changed everything about his assessment of the situation. Jake had come to Millfield expecting solitude, planning to sort through his failures in the company of memories and regrets. Instead, he'd stumbled into someone else's sanctuary, and the implications of that collision were as yet unclear. His first instinct was to leave, to respect whoever's privacy he had inadvertently invaded. But the deed in his pocket reminded him that, legally at least, this was now his privacy to protect or share as he saw fit. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor, Jake made his way back to the truck to retrieve his camping gear. The temperature would drop dramatically once the sun disappeared, and he wanted to have his sleeping arrangements sorted before full darkness fell. The desert night could be as punishing as the desert day, just in the opposite direction, and Hypothermia was as real a threat as heatstroke in this unforgiving landscape. He'd just finished rolling out his sleeping bag in the truck bed when he heard it. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, but distinct enough to freeze him in place. Singing. A woman's voice, soft and low, carrying a melody he didn't recognize, but that seemed to belong to this place in a way that his presence definitely did not. The voice was coming from somewhere deeper in the town, perhaps from one of the buildings he hadn't yet explored. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where he'd carried his sidearm throughout his tours overseas. But he was no longer a soldier in a combat zone, and the voice he was hearing carried no threat, only a kind of profound sadness that seemed to match the desolation of the landscape. Instead of reaching for a weapon he no longer carried, he found himself walking toward the sound, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. The singing stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving him standing in the middle of what had once been Millfield's main street, feeling foolish and uncertain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was different from what had come before, heavier somehow, charged with the awareness of mutual observation. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Jake was certain someone was watching him just as intently as he was trying to locate them. This was not how he'd imagined his first night as the owner of a ghost town would unfold. In his planning, such as it had been, he'd envisioned a kind of hermit's existence, working alone to restore what could be restored while he figured out what came next in his life. The possibility that Millfield might already have a resident, official or otherwise, had never occurred to him. Now he found himself in the awkward position of being both intruder and rightful owner, a contradiction that sat uncomfortably in his gut. The smart thing would be to return to Silver Ridge, to Tom Bradley's place where Emma was staying, and figure out how to handle this situation in daylight, with proper backup and clear thinking. But something kept him rooted in place. Some combination of stubborn pride and genuine curiosity about who might choose to call this desolate place home. He'd paid for the town, meager as that payment had been, and he'd driven 800 miles to claim it. One mysterious singer wasn't going to send him running back to the only friend he'd made in Nevada. The night air carried scents he was still learning to identify: creosote and sage, dust and distance, the particular smell of a landscape that had long since reached accommodation with scarcity. Above him, stars were becoming visible in numbers that still amazed him after a lifetime of light-polluted Montana skies. The desert night was revealing itself to be as magnificent as it was intimidating, a vast cathedral of darkness and celestial fire that made human concerns seem beautifully insignificant. Jake made his decision with the kind of deliberate calm that had served him well in more dangerous situations than this. He would spend the night as planned, making no effort to seek out or confront whoever shared his ghost town. In the morning, with better visibility and a clearer head, he would explore the situation properly. If there was someone living in Millfield, they'd managed to do so peacefully for however long they'd been here. One more night of coexistence wouldn't hurt anyone. He settled into his sleeping bag with the truck tailgate down, positioning himself so he could see most of the town while remaining relatively concealed. The temperature was indeed dropping rapidly, and he was grateful for the military-grade gear that had followed him from Afghanistan to Montana to this unlikely destination. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the buildings of Millfield took on a different character, less derelict and more mysterious. Shadows within shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with their own life. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and populated by dreams that mixed memories of his failed ranch with visions of the woman whose voice had carried such haunting sadness across the desert evening. In his dreams, she had a face that was both foreign and familiar, eyes that held the kind of deep knowledge that comes only from surviving great loss. She was trying to tell him something important, But every time he thought he understood her words, the dream shifted and her message slipped away like water through cupped hands. Jake woke to the sound of movement, his soldier's instincts bringing him to full alertness before his conscious mind had time to catalog the details of his surroundings. Dawn was still an hour away, but the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hint of the light that would transform the desert from a place of mystery back into a realm of harsh visibility. Someone was walking through the town, their footsteps soft but distinct in the pre-dawn quiet. He lay motionless in his sleeping bag, controlling his breathing and straining to track the sound of movement. Whoever it was moved with the confidence of long familiarity, navigating the uneven terrain without the hesitation that had marked Jake's own exploration the previous evening. The footsteps paused near what he thought might be the old church, lingered there for several minutes, then continued toward the far end of town where several smaller buildings clustered around what had probably been the original mine site. The temptation to follow was strong, but Jake's military experience had taught him the value of patience and observation. Better to learn what he could from a position of concealment than to risk a confrontation in the dark with someone who obviously knew this terrain far better than he did. Instead, he made mental notes of the pattern of movement, the timing, the apparent destination, information that might prove useful when full daylight allowed for a proper investigation. As the footsteps faded into the distance, Jake found himself thinking about the careful way the blanket had been folded in the general store, the respectful arrangement of supplies, the singing that had carried such profound sadness. Whoever shared this ghost town with him was not a threat, he felt increasingly certain. But they were also not simply a casual visitor. There was something deliberate and purposeful about their presence here, something that suggested a connection to Millfield that went deeper than convenience or temporary shelter. The eastern mountains were beginning to catch fire with the approaching sunrise when Jake finally gave up any pretense of sleep and climbed out of his sleeping bag. The desert morning was cold enough to make his breath visible, a reminder that extremes were the rule rather than the exception in this unforgiving landscape. He made coffee on his camp stove, grateful for the familiar ritual and the caffeine that would help him think clearly about the situation he'd discovered. By full daylight, Millfield looked less mysterious but no less desolate. The buildings that had seemed to pulse with hidden life during the night revealed themselves to be exactly what they appeared. Abandoned structures slowly surrendering to the patient assault of wind and weather. Yet Jake's certainty that he was not alone remained unshaken. Someone lived here, or at least visited regularly enough to leave the subtle signs he'd discovered. The question was what to do about it, and how to balance his legal ownership with whatever claim his mysterious neighbor might have to call this place home. The morning sun revealed details that had been hidden in the previous evening's exploration. Millfield was larger than he'd initially realized, with several buildings tucked back against the hillside that he hadn't noticed during his first survey. The mine entrance was clearly visible now, a dark mouth in the rock face that was blocked by a rusted iron grate. Warning signs, their paint faded but still legible, cautioned against trespassing and outlined the dangers of abandoned mine shafts. Jake spent the early morning hours conducting a more systematic exploration of his property, noting structural damage and cataloging what might be salvageable with the right application of time, money, and expertise. The general store was indeed the most solid building, though it would need extensive work to become habitable. The old saloon had potential if the foundation could be stabilized and the roof completely replaced. The church was a total loss, its roof collapsed and its walls beginning to bow outward in a way that suggested imminent catastrophe. It was while examining the cluster of smaller buildings near the mine that Jake made his second significant discovery. Tucked behind what had probably been the mine foreman's office was a structure that was clearly much older than the others. Built of different materials and in a style that suggested it predated the 1950s mining operation by decades. Adobe walls, thick and solid, supported a roof of weathered timber and clay tiles. A traditional southwestern building that belonged to an earlier chapter of this area's history. The door to this building was not only unlocked, but showed clear signs of regular use. The wood was worn smooth around the handle, and the hinges, while old, moved silently when Jake pushed the door open. Inside, he found what was unmistakably a lived-in space. Not luxuriously appointed, but clean and organized in a way that spoke of someone who took pride in their surroundings despite their obvious limitations. The single room contained a narrow bed with blankets that were old but well maintained, a small table and chair, shelves lined with books in both English and Spanish, and a corner that had been arranged as a kind of shrine or altar. Candles, flowers that must have been freshly picked, photographs in ornate frames, and what appeared to be small offerings of food and drink. The whole arrangement spoke of reverence and continuity, of traditions being maintained despite isolation and hardship. Jake stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of trespass more heavily than he had at any point since discovering evidence of occupancy. This wasn't a temporary shelter or occasional retreat. This was someone's home, carefully tended and clearly beloved. The legal deed in his pocket might give him ownership of the land, but it felt increasingly meaningless in the face of the obvious emotional investment that had been made in this place. He was about to retreat when a voice behind him, speaking in accented but clear English, froze him in place. "You are the man who bought our town." It wasn't a question. Jake turned slowly to face a woman who appeared to be in her 70s. Small and weathered but carrying herself with unmistakable dignity. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes held an intelligence and wariness that seemed to take his measure with practiced efficiency. She wore a simple dress that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended, and her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses and scars of someone who had worked hard throughout her long life. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice rough from the morning air and the surprise of finally meeting his mysterious neighbor. "I'm Jake Thompson. I bought Millfield from the county yesterday." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. "I am Maria Santos," she said, extending her hand with formal courtesy. "Welcome to our home." The handshake was firm despite her age, weathered skin that spoke of decades under the desert sun. Maria Santos held Jake's gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had faced down harder men than him and lived to tell about it. Her presence transformed everything about the morning, turning what had been a solitary exploration into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. "Our home," Jake repeated carefully, testing the weight of those words. "How long have you been living here, Mrs. Santos?" "Senora Santos," she corrected gently, then seemed to consider his question with the deliberation of someone choosing which truth to reveal. "My family has been in Millfield since 1943. I was born in that house over there." She pointed to one of the smaller adobe structures that Jake had assumed was uninhabitable. "My grandfather came here to work the silver mine when they first opened it, before the gringos made it famous." The casual use of the term carried no malice, Jake realized, just the matter-of-fact directness of someone stating historical facts. He found himself studying her face more carefully, noting the strong cheekbones and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, evidence of someone who had learned to find humor even in difficult circumstances. "So you've been here through everything," Jake said. "The boom, the bust, all of it." "Sí, to do," Maria agreed, switching briefly to Spanish before returning to English. "I watched them come with their big machines and bigger dreams. I watched them leave when the silver played out. I buried my husband in the cemetery on the hill when the last of the mining families pulled out in 1968, and I stayed." The simple declaration carried the weight of an epic, decades of solitude and persistence that Jake could barely comprehend. He thought of his own recent losses, the ranch and marriage that had defined his adult life, and tried to imagine choosing To remain in the wreckage rather than starting fresh somewhere else. Why? The question escaped before he could consider whether it was appropriate to ask. Maria smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features into something almost girlish. Where else would I go? This is where my people are buried. This is where my memories live. This is where I belong. She gestured toward the town spread around them. These buildings may be empty, but they are not abandoned. Not as long as I am here to remember what they were. Jake felt a growing unease in his stomach, the uncomfortable realization that his simple plan to buy cheap land and start over was colliding with something far more complicated than property law. Maria Santos wasn't just living in his ghost town. She was the keeper of its soul, the living connection between its past and whatever future it might have. Mrs. Santos. Senora Santos, he corrected himself. I need you to understand something. I bought Millfield legally from the county. I have the deed. That doesn't mean I want to throw you out, but legally, this property belongs to me now. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a hardening that suggested. She'd heard variations of this speech before. Legally, she repeated, as if tasting the word. See, the papers always matter to you people. More than the people who actually live somewhere, who care for it, who keep its stories alive. The accusation stung because it carried an uncomfortable kernel of truth. Jake had focused entirely on the legal aspects of his purchase, never considering that someone might have a claim to Millfield that had nothing to do with county records or property taxes. He'd been thinking like a businessman, or perhaps like a soldier following orders, when the situation clearly demanded more nuanced understanding. That's not what I meant, Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he had meant. I'm just trying to figure out how this works. I came here thinking the town was empty. Empty of what? Maria asked, her voice carrying an edge now. Empty. Of white people? Empty of people who pay taxes? Empty of people who matter to the county clerk. She shook her head with obvious disappointment. Millfield has never been empty, Senator Thompson. It has been ignored, forgotten, dismissed, but never empty. The rebuke was delivered without heat, but it landed with the force of truth. Jake realized he'd made the same assumptions that had probably led every other potential buyer to pass on Millfield over the decades. He'd seen only the absence of what he expected to find, not the presence of what was actually there. You're right, he admitted, the words coming harder than they should have. I made assumptions. I should have done more research, should have. Tried to find out if anyone was still living here before I made the purchase. Maria studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his contrition was genuine or merely strategic. Whatever she saw there seemed to soften her stance slightly. Most people who come here see only what is broken, she said. They see buildings that need repair, land that needs development, opportunities to make money. They do not see the life that continues in quiet ways. Jake looked around at the sun-baked buildings, trying to see them through her eyes rather than his own. The general store where she'd been leaving signs of her presence. The church where she might still come to pray despite its collapsing roof. The cemetery on the hill where her husband rested along with generations of families who had called this harsh place home. Tell me about that life, Jake said, surprising himself with the request. Help me understand what I've stumbled into. Maria's expression shifted again, suspicion giving way to something that might have been cautious hope. She gestured toward her small adobe house, and Jake realized she was inviting him inside, treating him as a guest despite their complicated circumstances. The interior of her home was a revelation. What had appeared spartanly furnished from the doorway revealed itself to be rich with history and personal meaning. The books on her shelves included volumes in Spanish and English, ranging from religious texts to works of literature to practical guides on desert survival and traditional medicine. The photographs on the altar weren't just random family pictures, but a carefully curated gallery of Millfield's past, Images of the town during its heyday, of families and workers, of celebrations and daily life. "My grandfather, Eduardo Santos," Maria said, pointing to a formal portrait of a serious-looking man in mining clothes. "He came here from Sonora in 1943, following rumors of silver that would make him rich enough to send for my grandmother. The silver was real, but the riches—" She shrugged eloquently. Jake found himself drawn into the narrative, despite his original intentions to keep this encounter brief and businesslike. Maria moved through her small space with unconscious grace, preparing coffee on a camping stove while continuing her family's history. "My father was born here in 1945, the first Santos to be an American citizen from birth. He married my mother in the little church when it still had a roof and walls that didn't lean. I came along in 1950 when the town was at its busiest. We had nearly 400 people then, 2 stores, a cantina, even a small school." She handed Jake a cup of coffee that was stronger than anything he'd tasted outside of Army mess halls, rich and dark with a slight bitter edge that somehow suited the conversation. "What happened when the mine played out?" Jake asked, settling into the single chair she offered while she perched on the edge of her narrow bed. "What always happens," Maria said with the weary acceptance of someone who had witnessed the cycle multiple times. "The company men came with their clipboards and their sad faces, telling us the vein was exhausted, the operation was no longer profitable. They offered to help people relocate, to find work in other mines, other towns. Most families took the offer. But not yours. My father was stubborn, like all Santos men. He believed the company was lying, that there was still silver in those hills if you knew where to look. He thought they just wanted to buy up the land cheap and come back later with better equipment." Maria's smile held no humor. He was wrong about the silver, but perhaps not wrong about the land. Jake thought about his own $105 purchase and wondered what Eduardo Santos would have made of such a transaction. "So your family stayed and tried to make it work?" "We stayed because this was our home and we had nowhere else to go. My mother cleaned houses in Silver Ridge when she could get work. My father prospected in the played-out tunnels until the day he died in 1971, still believing he would strike it rich. I married Miguel Santos in 1969, and we tried to raise cattle on the scrubland around the town. Santos married Santos. No relation, just coincidence. Miguel's family came from a different part of Mexico, different time. But yes, it made the paperwork simple." She laughed, the first genuinely joyful sound Jake had heard from her. "Miguel was a good man, patient with my father's dreams and my stubborn refusal to leave this place, even when it became clear we were the last ones here." Jake tried to imagine the isolation of being the final residents of a dying town, watching neighbors and friends pack up their lives and disappear one by one until only silence remained. The loneliness must have been crushing, yet Maria spoke of those years with a matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested she'd found ways to make peace with solitude. "Miguel died in 1995, she continued, her voice growing softer. "Heart attack while he was checking on the cattle. I found him that evening when he didn't come home for supper. After that, it was just me and the ghosts." "Why didn't you leave then?" Jake asked gently. "After he was gone, what kept you here?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the town beyond. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades of solitary contemplation. "Where would I go? I was 67 years old, no children, no family anywhere else. Social Security sends me a small check each month, but not enough to rent an apartment in Silver Ridge, much less anywhere with more opportunities. But more than that." She paused, searching for the right words. "This place needs someone to remember it properly. The county records show when the mine opened and when it closed, but they don't show Maria Hernandez teaching school in her kitchen, when the official schoolhouse was being built, They don't show old Charlie Morrison playing violin on Saturday nights in the cantina, or how the whole town came together to help when the flash flood of 1961 took out half the main street. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that Maria Santos wasn't just a squatter he needed to deal with, but a living library of everything that had made Millfield more than just a collection of buildings in the desert. "You've been the town historian," he said. "I've been the town," she replied simply. "When everyone else left, I became Millfield. Population 1, but still a real place with real history that deserved to be remembered properly." The implications of her statement were staggering. For nearly 30 years, Maria had single-handedly maintained not just her own survival in an impossible place, but the cultural memory of an entire community. She'd been curator, caretaker, and chronicler all at once, preserving stories and traditions that would otherwise have vanished completely. "The singing I heard last night," Jake said, pieces falling into place. "You were in the cemetery. Every evening at sunset, I sing the old songs to keep the spirits company. Miguel is up there, and my parents, and dozens of others who lived their whole lives here. They shouldn't be alone in the dark." She looked at Jake with challenge in her eyes. "Is that against the law now that you own the land?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Jake realized that his legal ownership of Millfield meant he now controlled access to her husband's grave, to the resting places of everyone she had ever loved. The casual cruelty of that arrangement struck him like a physical blow. "Of course not," he said quickly. "I would never. That cemetery is yours to visit whenever you want, forever." Something in Maria's posture relaxed slightly, though. Wariness remained in her eyes. "Gracias. That is more kindness than I expected from someone who buys towns like groceries." Jake winced at the accurate description of his impulsive purchase. "I'm not normally so careless about these things. The truth is, I lost everything I had in Montana and came here because I didn't know where else to go. Buying Millfield was partly desperation and partly hope that I could build something new from the ruins of what I'd lost." "What did you lose?" Maria asked, her tone gentling slightly. Jake found himself telling her about the ranch, about Danny Morrison's betrayal, about Sarah taking Emma back to California, and the divorce that had finalized just days before his trip to Nevada. He talked about the foreclosure and the legal battles and the gradual realization that everything he'd worked for could disappear through forces entirely beyond his control. "You came here to hide," Maria observed when he finished. "I came here to start over. Same thing, sometimes. I hid here for 28 years after Miguel died, telling myself I was preserving history when mostly I was afraid to face a world that had moved on without me." She studied Jake's face carefully. "The question is what you plan to do now that you know you're not hiding alone." It was the central dilemma, Jake realized, the collision between his legal rights and Maria's moral claims, between his need for a fresh start and her determination to protect the only home she'd ever known. In Afghanistan, complex situations like this had clear chains of command and established protocols. Here, he was entirely on his own to figure out what justice looked like when law and ethics pointed in different directions. "I don't know," he admitted. "A week ago, I thought I'd bought some empty buildings and land where I could figure out what comes next in my life. Now I find out I've accidentally become responsible for someone else's entire world. I'm not sure how to balance those things." "You could evict me," Maria said matter-of-factly. "Call the sheriff, have me removed as a trespasser. The law would support you completely." "I could," Jake agreed. "But I won't." "Why not? It would solve your problem cleanly." Jake thought about the shrine in her house, the photographs of families who had built their lives in this harsh place, the songs she sang each evening to keep the dead company. He thought about his own losses and the way grief could make someone cling to places and memories with desperate intensity. "Because it wouldn't be right," he said finally. You've earned your place here in ways that have nothing to do with property deeds. I may own the land, but you own the history. And honestly, after losing everything that mattered to me, I'm not eager to take away what matters to someone else." Maria nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she'd been trying to determine about his character. "So what do you propose?" "I don't know yet. Give me some time to think about it, to figure out if there's a way we can both get what we need from this situation." Jake paused, struck by a sudden thought. "You mentioned your Social Security check doesn't stretch very far. Have you been living entirely on that?" "Mostly. I grow some vegetables, trade for supplies and silver. Ridge when I can. It's not much, but it's enough for one old woman who doesn't need very much." Jake looked around the small, neat space, noting the careful way everything was maintained despite obvious resource limitations. Maria Santos had been living below the poverty line for decades, yet she'd somehow preserved both her dignity and her sense of purpose in circumstances that would have broken most people. What if there was a way to change that? Jake asked, an idea beginning to form. What if instead of seeing each other as obstacles, we figured out how to be allies? "What do you mean?" "I mean you know everything there is to know about this place, and I have legal ownership but no knowledge of what I'm dealing with. You need financial security, and I need someone who understands the history and the land. Maybe there's a partnership there." Maria's eyes sharpened with interest, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. "What kind of partnership? I don't know yet, but I'm thinking there might be value in what you've been doing all these years, preserving the history and stories of Millfield. Maybe there are people who would pay to hear those stories, to learn about the real history of places like this." Jake's mind was racing now, possibilities multiplying faster than he could evaluate them. What if instead of trying to develop Millfield into something new, we preserved it as it is, but made it accessible to people who are interested in authentic Western history? A museum? Maria asked skeptically. "Not exactly. More like a living history experience. You could continue doing what you've been doing, but with support and resources to do it properly. I could handle the business side, the marketing, the facilities management. We could offer tours, educational programs, maybe even host events that celebrate the kind of community Millfield used to be." The idea was half-formed and probably impractical, but Jake could see the spark of possibility in Maria's eyes. For the first time since meeting her, she looked genuinely intrigued rather than merely defensive. "People would want to visit a ghost town?" she asked. "People love authentic experiences, especially ones that connect them to history that's usually forgotten or romanticized. What you've preserved here is real, unvarnished truth about what life was like for ordinary people trying to make it in an impossible place. That's valuable, Maria. That's worth sharing." She was quiet for a long time, turning the idea over, in her mind with the careful consideration of someone who had learned not to trust easy promises or quick solutions. When she finally spoke, her voice carried cautious hope. It would mean strangers coming here, disturbing the peace, maybe not treating the place with proper respect. It would mean controlled access, people who've paid to be here and understand. They're visiting something special. We could set rules, establish boundaries, make sure the integrity of what you've preserved is protected. Jake leaned forward, feeling genuine excitement for the first time in months. "Think about it, Maria. Instead of the stories dying with you, they could live on through the people who hear them. The families who lived here, their struggles and triumphs, could become part of a larger conversation about the American West, about immigrant experiences, about communities that history usually overlooks. And you would make money from this. We would make money from this. Partners, equal shares in whatever we build together. You bring the knowledge and authenticity. I bring the business skills and legal ownership. Neither of us could do it alone, but together we might be able to create something worthwhile." Maria Santos stood up and walked to her small window. looking out at the town that had shaped her entire life. Jake could see her weighing possibilities, calculating risks, trying to determine if this gringo stranger was offering genuine partnership or simply a more palatable form of exploitation. "I would need to think about this," she said finally. "It's not a decision to make quickly. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Maria, whatever you decide about the business idea, you should know that you have a place here for as long as you want it. That's not negotiable." She turned back to face him, and Jake was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "That's the first time in 28 years that anyone has said I belong somewhere." The raw gratitude in her voice made Jake's chest tight with emotion. He realized that his impulsive purchase of a ghost town had given him more than just land and buildings. It had made him responsible for preserving something irreplaceable, the dignity and security of a woman who had spent decades being ignored by a world that had decided she didn't matter. "You do belong here," Jake said firmly. "More than anyone else, including me. This is your home. Maria, I'm just a newcomer who needs to figure out how to fit into the story you've been writing all these years." As he walked back toward his truck in the growing heat of the desert morning, Jake felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd come to Nevada seeking solitude and simplicity, a chance to heal from his losses in peace. Instead, he'd found complexity and connection, a chance to build something meaningful from the intersection of his needs and Maria Santos' lifetime of faithful stewardship. The ghost town he'd bought for $105 was about to teach him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, only earned through respect, patience, and the willingness to see beyond the surface of what appeared to be empty ruins. The rumble of expensive engines carried across the desert like distant thunder, a sound that had no business in the profound silence that usually blanketed Millfield. Jake looked up from the foundation work he'd been doing on the general store, squinting against the afternoon glare to see a convoy of black SUVs approaching down the dirt road. 3 vehicles moving with the purposeful precision of a military operation, their pristine paint jobs and gleaming chrome incongruous against the weathered landscape. Maria emerged from her adobe house, shading her eyes with one hand as she watched the approaching vehicles. Even from a distance, Jake could see the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to brace herself for whatever was coming. In the 2 weeks since their first conversation, they'd fallen into an easy routine of shared labor and planning. But this interruption felt ominous in ways neither of them had anticipated. The lead SUV pulled to a stop in what had once been Millfield's main street, followed by the other 2 in a formation that effectively blocked any easy escape route. The doors opened in synchronized precision, and out stepped men in expensive suits that looked ridiculous in the desert heat. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through a combination of wealth and intimidation. Jake wiped his hands on his work shirt and walked over to where Maria stood, noting that she'd unconsciously positioned herself between the newcomers and her home. The protective gesture spoke to decades of experience dealing with people who saw her as an obstacle rather than a person. "Gentlemen," Jake called out as the group approached, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned in the army. "What can I do for you?" The silver-haired leader smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I presume." "I'm Robert Fletcher, Fletcher Development Corporation. I believe we need to have a conversation about your recent acquisition here in Millfield." The name meant nothing to Jake, but he noticed Maria stiffen beside him. Apparently, Fletcher's reputation had preceded him in ways that didn't bode well for whatever conversation he had in mind. "I wasn't aware my purchase was anyone else's business," Jake replied evenly. "The sale was completed legally through the county, all taxes and fees paid in full." Fletcher's smile widened, taking on a predatory quality that reminded Jake uncomfortably of certain officers he'd known in the military. Men who enjoyed having power over others more than they enjoyed using it constructively. Oh, the legality isn't in question, Mr. Thompson. It's the timing that's unfortunate. You see, my company has been in negotiations with the county for several months regarding a comprehensive development plan for this entire area. Your little impulse purchase has created some complications for a project that could bring significant economic benefits to the region. What kind of development? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Luxury resort and casino complex, taking advantage of Nevada's gaming laws and the proximity to Reno. We're talking about a $500 million investment that would create thousands of jobs and generate substantial tax revenue for the county. Fletcher gestured expansively at the surrounding landscape. This wasteland could become a premier destination for high-end tourism, but only if we can assemble the necessary land parcels into a coherent development package. Jake felt Maria tense beside him, and he understood why. Fletcher wasn't just talking about developing empty land. He was talking about erasing Millfield entirely, obliterating the history and memories that Maria had spent her lifetime preserving. Sounds like a county planning issue, Jake said. If you had a deal in the works, you should have secured the land before someone else bought it. Fletcher's expression hardened slightly, the veneer of friendliness cracking to reveal something considerably less pleasant underneath. Let's not pretend this is about real estate law. Mr. Thompson, you paid $105 for property that my geological surveys suggest contains substantial mineral deposits. The old mine was never properly explored with modern equipment. We believe there are significant precious metal reserves that could be extracted profitably with current technology. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd assumed Millfield was worthless except for its historical significance. But if Fletcher was right about mineral deposits, his $105 investment could be worth millions. The irony was bitter. He'd finally found financial security, but only by accident and in a way that would destroy everything Maria cared about. Even if that's true, Jake said carefully, it doesn't change the fact that I own the property legally. If you want to make an offer, we can discuss it through proper channels. Actually, Mr. Thompson, that's exactly what I'm here to do. Fletcher reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. This is an offer to purchase your holdings in Millfield for $2 million, cash, with a 30-day closing. Period. More than generous compensation for your investment, I think you'll agree. The number was staggering, more money than Jake had ever imagined having. $2 million would solve every financial problem he'd accumulated over the past year, would let him start over anywhere he chose with enough capital to build something substantial. It would also obliterate Maria's home and turn the cemetery, where her husband rested, into the foundation for a casino parking lot. That's a lot of money, Jake admitted, not taking the document Fletcher offered. It's enough money to set you up for life anywhere you want to go. Montana, California, wherever your heart desires. You could buy a real ranch, not some hard scrabble. Desert property that will never be worth developing on its own. Fletcher's voice took on the persuasive tone of a practiced salesman. Think about it, Mr. Thompson. You came here because you lost everything, right? This is your chance to get it all back and more. Jake glanced at Maria, who was staring at the ground with the resigned expression of someone who had expected this moment, but hoped it would never come. In her weathered face, he could see the accumulated weight of decades of being displaced, ignored, and dismissed by people with more money and power than conscience. What happens to the current residents? Jake asked. Fletcher looked genuinely puzzled. Current residents? Mr. Thompson, this is a ghost town. There are no current residents. Actually, there are, Jake said firmly, placing his hand on Maria's shoulder. Senora Santos has been living here for over 50 years. This is her home. Fletcher's eyes flicked to Maria with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for inconvenient obstacles. I see. Well, I'm sure we can arrange appropriate relocation assistance. There are excellent senior living facilities in Reno that would provide much better care than she could possibly receive in this isolated location. The casual cruelty of the suggestion, the assumption that Maria's preferences and attachments were irrelevant compared to his development plans, triggered something hot and protective in Jake's chest. He'd seen this attitude before, in Afghanistan. And in business, the way powerful people treated local populations as movable pieces on a game board rather than human beings with legitimate claims to dignity and self-determination. She doesn't want to relocate, Jake said, his voice hardening. This is her ancestral home. Her family is buried here. Mr. Thompson, Fletcher said with strained patience, surely you can see the bigger picture here. We're talking about economic development that will benefit thousands of people, create lasting prosperity for the entire region. One elderly woman's sentimental attachment to a dead town can't be allowed to stand in the way of that kind of progress. Progress, Maria spoke. For the first time since Fletcher's arrival, her voice quiet but carrying an edge that made everyone turn to look at her. Is that what you call destroying a place where 4 generations of my family lived and died? Progress is erasing the cemetery where my husband rests so you can build a casino parking lot? Fletcher's mask of civility slipped completely, revealing the contempt that had been lurking beneath his professional demeanor. Ma'am, with respect, this land has been economically dead for decades. Whatever historical significance it might have had is vastly outweighed by its potential to contribute to Nevada's economic growth. Surely even you can understand that. What I understand, Maria replied with dignity that made Fletcher's arrogance look even more grotesque by comparison, is that you see only dollar signs where I see the graves of people who built there. Lives in this place. You see empty buildings where I see the homes where children were born and families were raised. You call it progress to erase all of that so rich people can gamble and drink in air-conditioned comfort. Jake felt a surge of admiration for Maria's quiet strength, the way she refused to be intimidated by Fletcher's wealth and barely concealed threats. At the same time, he was acutely aware of the impossible position Fletcher's offer had created. $2 million represented financial security beyond anything he'd dreamed of achieving, but accepting it would make him complicit in the destruction of everything Maria held sacred. Mr. Thompson, Fletcher said, turning his attention back to Jake with obvious calculation, I understand this puts you in a difficult position. You feel some sympathy for Mrs. Santos, Maria supplied coldly. Mrs. Santos, naturally. But you need to consider your own interests here. $2 million is more than generous for property that cost you practically nothing. Turn it down, and you might find yourself in a more adversarial situation than you'd prefer. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Fletcher was suggesting that he had ways of making Jake's life difficult if he didn't accept the buyout offer willingly. What kind of adversarial situation? Jake asked, his military training automatically cataloging potential threats and responses. Oh, nothing dramatic, Fletcher replied with false reassurance. But property development involves many regulatory hurdles, environmental assessments, zoning approvals. The county has significant discretion in how quickly and favorably those processes proceed. A cooperative landowner finds the bureaucracy remarkably efficient. An uncooperative one sometimes discovers unexpected complications. Jake understood perfectly. Fletcher was threatening to use his political connections to make any development of Millfield prohibitively expensive and time-consuming unless Jake sold on Fletcher's terms. It was legal extortion, dressed up in the language of business negotiation. And if I don't cooperate with your timeline? Jake asked. Fletcher's smile returned, cold and calculating. Then you might find yourself tied up in regulatory red tape for years, spending more on legal fees and compliance costs than you could ever hope to recover from a property that generates no income. Meanwhile, Mrs. Santos here continues to age in isolation, far from proper medical care and social services. Accidents happen to elderly people living alone in remote locations, Mr. Thompson. Tragic, but unfortunately common. The implied threat against Maria crossed a line that Jake hadn't expected Fletcher to approach so blatantly. The suggestion that harm might come to her if Jake didn't sell was delivered with plausible deniability, but the message was crystal clear. "Are you threatening her?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that had preceded violence in more dangerous situations than this one. "Of course not," Fletcher replied smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out the realities of elderly people living in isolated conditions without adequate support systems. It's a legitimate concern for anyone who cares about her welfare." Jake looked at the men Fletcher had brought with him, noting their positions and body language with the automatic tactical assessment of someone trained to recognize and respond to threats. They weren't obviously armed, but they carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to intimidation and prepared to escalate beyond words if necessary. "I need time to think about your offer," Jake said finally. "Of course," Fletcher agreed, his tone suggesting he considered the negotiation essentially concluded. "But don't take too long. Market conditions can change quickly, and my investors aren't known for their patience with prolonged decision-making processes." He handed Jake a business card along with the purchase agreement. "You have my direct number. When you're ready to proceed, call me personally. We can have this wrapped up within a week of your decision." As quickly as they had arrived, Fletcher and his entourage departed, leaving Jake and Maria standing in the dust cloud kicked up by their expensive vehicles. The silence that followed felt different from the usual desert quiet, charged with tension and the weight of decisions that would affect far more than just their own lives. "You should take his money," Maria said quietly, not looking at Jake. "What? $2 million? It's more money than you'll ever see again, and God knows you've lost enough already. Don't throw away your chance at financial security because of an old woman's stubbornness." Jake stared at her in amazement. "Maria, this is your home, your family's land. I'm not going to sell it out from under you so some casino can pave over your husband's grave. Miguel is dead, Jake. All of them are dead. The living matter more than the dead, and you have a daughter who deserves a secure future more than I deserve to spend my remaining years guarding empty buildings." The selflessness of her position made Jake's chest ache with emotions he struggled to identify. Here was a woman who had sacrificed everything to preserve what mattered to her, yet she was willing to give it all up to ensure he didn't lose the financial opportunity of a lifetime. "That's not how this works," Jake said firmly. "I didn't come here to get rich quick. I came here to build something meaningful, something that matters. What you've preserved here matters, Maria. It matters more than Fletcher's casino." Pretty words, but you have to think practically. That man isn't going to give up just because you say no. He has money, political connections, probably lawyers who specialize in making life difficult for people who stand in his way. Can you afford to fight someone like that? Jake thought about his dwindling savings, his lack of local connections, the precarious legal position of someone who had bought property without fully understanding what he was acquiring. Fletcher was right that he could make development prohibitively expensive through regulatory manipulation, and Jake's resources were too limited to sustain a prolonged legal battle. "Maybe not," Jake admitted, "but I can't live with myself if I don't try. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the odds are bad." Maria turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether his resolve was genuine or merely the temporary bravado of someone who hadn't yet grasped full scope of what they were facing. "You could lose everything," she warned. "Again, I've already lost everything once. It didn't kill me." Jake managed a smile that felt more confident than he actually felt. "Besides, I'm not planning to lose this time." "What makes you think this time will be different?" Jake looked around at the buildings of Millfield, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the cemetery on the hill where generations of Maria's family rested in the desert soil. He thought about Fletcher's casual dismissal of history and human dignity, about the threat implicit in his concern for Maria's safety, about the kind of world that would be created if people like Fletcher always got their way simply because they had more money and power. "Because this time I'm not fighting alone," Jake said. "And this time I'm fighting for something bigger than just my own interests." Over the following days, Jake threw himself into research with the focused intensity of someone preparing for battle. He drove to Carson City to study land use regulations, spent hours on the phone with environmental lawyers, and reached out to historical preservation societies that might have an interest in protecting sites like Millfield. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Nevada's environmental protection laws were stronger than he'd expected, particularly regarding sites with potential archaeological or cultural significance. The presence of Native American artifacts or burial sites could trigger lengthy review processes that would delay any development for years. On the other hand, Fletcher's political connections were extensive, and his development company had a track record of successfully navigating regulatory challenges through a combination of legal expertise and strategic campaign contributions. The more Jake learned about his opponent, the more he understood why Maria had assumed resistance was futile. Fletcher Development Corporation had annual revenues in the hundreds of millions, a legal team that specialized in land acquisition, disputes, and relationships with politicians at every level of Nevada government. Jake was a broke ex-rancher with a $105 ghost town and a determination that was probably worth more to him than it was to anyone else. But Jake had also learned things during his military service that Fletcher's money couldn't buy. He understood the importance of intelligence gathering, of finding and exploiting weaknesses in seemingly superior forces, of building alliances that could multiply limited resources into effective resistance. His first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, the sheriff who had befriended Jake during his initial visit to Silver Ridge, mentioned during a casual conversation that Fletcher's previous developments had generated significant environmental complaints. A luxury golf resort near Lake Tahoe had been cited for illegal water usage during drought conditions. A casino project in Laughlin had been delayed for 2 years due to concerns about impacts on desert wildlife habitats. "Guy's got deep pockets and good lawyers," Tom observed, "but he's not invincible. Seems like he tends to cut corners on environmental compliance, figuring he can lawyer his way out of trouble later. Might be worth looking into whether that pattern extends to his Millfield proposal." Jake began digging deeper into Fletcher's business practices using freedom of information. Requests to obtain copies of environmental impact studies from his previous projects. What he found was a consistent pattern of minimal compliance with environmental regulations, projects that proceeded based on the assumption that any violations could be resolved through financial settlements rather than actual remediation. More importantly, Jake discovered that Fletcher's geological surveys of Millfield had never been filed with the appropriate state agencies. If the surveys were accurate and significant mineral deposits existed, Fletcher was required by law to disclose that information as part of any development proposal. His failure to do so suggested he was trying to acquire the land without revealing its true value, then presumably sell the mineral rights separately at enormous profit. The discovery gave Jake his first real weapon in what was shaping up to be a very unequal fight. Environmental fraud and failure to disclose mineral assets were serious violations that could result in criminal charges as well as civil penalties. More importantly, they provided grounds for challenging Fletcher's development proposal and potentially delaying it long enough for Jake to build a more comprehensive defense. Jake shared his findings with Maria over dinner in her small adobe house, watching her face carefully as he explained the implications of what he'd discovered. "So he's been lying about why he wants the land," she said when he finished. "Lying and probably breaking federal disclosure laws in the process. If we can prove he knew about mineral deposits and failed to report them, we might be able to get his entire development proposal thrown out." Maria was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands as she processed this information. When she finally looked up, her expression was troubled in ways that went beyond concern about Fletcher's legal violations. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned before, but I wasn't sure it mattered." The serious tone of her voice made Jake's stomach clench with apprehension. "What is it?" "My grandfather, Eduardo, the one who came here in 1943, he didn't come here because of the silver mine. He came here because he'd found something else in these hills, something he thought was more valuable than silver." Maria paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are caves in the mountains behind the town, caves that contain paintings and artifacts left by the people who lived here long before any miners or settlers arrived." Jake felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. "Native American sites? Petroglyphs, pottery fragments, tool-making areas. My grandfather was a curandero, a traditional healer, and he recognized the spiritual significance of what he'd found. He made agreements with the tribal elders, promised to protect the sites from disturbance. That's the real reason my family stayed here even after the silver played out. We weren't just preserving the history of the mining town. We were protecting sacred sites that are thousands of years old." The implications hit Jake like an avalanche. If Millfield contained significant Native American archaeological sites, it would be protected under multiple federal laws that took precedence over any state or local development regulations. Fletcher's casino project wouldn't just be delayed. It would be permanently prohibited. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Jake asked. "Because the tribal elders made my grandfather promise to keep the site secret, to protect them from archaeologists and curiosity seekers who might disturb them for academic purposes. For 80 years, my family has honored that promise. The tribes trust us because we've proven we can keep their secrets." Jake understood the moral complexity of Maria's position. She held information that could definitively stop Fletcher's development, but using it would violate decades of trust and potentially expose sacred sites to exactly the kind of outside interference her family had sworn to prevent. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. "I want to talk to the tribal council, to explain what we're facing and let them decide how to proceed. If they choose to reveal the sites publicly, that's their decision to make. If they prefer to handle this through their own legal channels, we respect that. But I won't betray their trust by unilaterally exposing sacred places to save my own home." Jake nodded, understanding that Maria was once again choosing principle over personal advantage. Her willingness to potentially sacrifice her own interests to honor commitments made by previous generations spoke to a kind of integrity that was becoming increasingly rare in his experience. "How do we contact them?" "Carefully," Maria replied, "and with great respect for the fact that we're asking them to risk something sacred to help us with a problem created by people who have never shown them anything but contempt and exploitation." As Jake lay in his sleeping bag that night, staring up at stars that seemed close enough to touch, he realized that his simple plan to buy a cheap ghost town and start over had evolved into something far more complex and significant. He was no longer just fighting to protect his investment or even to preserve Maria's home. He was potentially becoming the guardian of sites that had been sacred for millennia, taking on responsibilities that connected him to struggles that long predated his own problems. The weight of that responsibility was both frightening and oddly comforting. For the first time since losing his ranch, Jake felt like he was part of something larger than his own failures and regrets, something that would matter regardless of whether he personally succeeded or failed in his immediate goals. Fletcher's $2 million suddenly seemed like a very small consideration compared to the true value of what Jake had. accidentally purchased for $105. He'd bought not just buildings and land, but the chance to do something that actually mattered, something that honored both the dead and the living, something that proved ordinary people could still stand up to wealth and power when they had justice on their side. Whether he was strong enough to see that fight through to victory remained to be seen, but Jake was no longer in any doubt about whether it was a fight worth having. The tribal council meeting took place in a modest conference room at the Shoshone Paiute Reservation Office, 20 miles south of Silver Ridge. Jake sat beside Maria at a table scarred by years of difficult conversations, facing 8 tribal elders whose weathered faces spoke of lifetimes spent navigating the treacherous waters. Between tradition and necessity, the morning sun slanted through dusty windows, illuminating the tension that filled the room like smoke. Joseph Windwalker, the council chairman, was a man in his 70s whose gray braids and careful manner suggested someone who had learned to measure words as precisely as a jeweler weighed precious metals. His dark eyes studied Jake with an intensity that made him acutely aware of how much he didn't understand about the situation he'd stumbled into. "Senora Santos," Windwalker said in accented English, nodding respectfully to Maria. "You honor your grandfather's promise by bringing this matter to us before taking action. Eduardo was a man of his word, and his family has proven worthy of the trust we placed in them." Maria inclined her head gracefully. "The sacred sites have been protected for 80 years, but now they face a threat that my family cannot handle alone. This man," she gestured to Jake, "owns the land legally, but he has chosen to respect what my grandfather swore to protect. We seek the council's guidance on how to proceed." An elderly woman named Grace Featherstone leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Jake with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Thompson, you paid money for land that was never really for sale. The mining company took what they wanted and left, but they never owned what truly matters in those hills. What gives you the right to speak for places that were sacred before your people ever arrived on this continent?" The directness of the question caught Jake off guard, but he recognized the fundamental challenge it represented. His legal ownership meant nothing if it wasn't grounded in some deeper understanding of his responsibilities to the land and its original inhabitants. "I don't have that right," Jake admitted. "I'm here because I've learned that my legal title comes with moral obligations I never expected. I can't protect the sacred sites without your guidance, and I won't make decisions about them without your consent. What I can offer is my commitment to do whatever the council decides is best, even if it costs me everything I have." Another council member, a younger man named Thomas Crow Dog, spoke up with barely concealed anger. "Costs you everything? What have you risked compared to what we've lost over the past 150 years? You buy our stolen land for pocket change and expect gratitude because you're willing to give it back when it becomes inconvenient to keep." The accusation stung because it contained uncomfortable truth. Jake's purchase had been motivated by personal desperation, not any awareness of or respect for the area's indigenous history. His willingness to do the right thing now didn't erase the casual colonialism that had led him to assume he could buy sacred land simply because it was legally available. "You're right," Jake said, meeting Crow Dog's hostile gaze directly. "I acted out of ignorance and self-interest. I can't undo that, but I can try to use my legal position to protect what should never have been endangered in the first place. If the council wants me to transfer ownership to the tribe, I'll do it. If you want to handle Fletcher's development threat through your own legal channels, I'll support that however I can. This isn't about what I want anymore." Maria placed her hand on Jake's arm, a gesture of support that seemed to carry weight with the council members. "This man has had 2 chances to become rich by betraying what we're trying to protect. He has chosen honor both times, even though it means facing an enemy with resources he cannot match." Windwalker was quiet for a long moment, studying both Jake and Maria with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making decisions that would affect multiple generations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of inherited wisdom. The sites in those hills are not just archaeologically significant. They are living parts of our spiritual practice, places where our ancestors still speak. To those who know how to listen. For 80 years, the Santos family has kept faith with our agreement, never disturbing what should remain undisturbed, never revealing what should remain hidden. That trust cannot be extended lightly to others. Jake felt the weight of judgment settling on his shoulders, understanding that everything he said and did in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the future of places that had been sacred for millennia. "I understand that trust has to be earned," Jake replied carefully. "I'm not asking you to trust me with your secrets. I'm asking you to let me help protect them from someone who would destroy them for profit." Fletcher doesn't care about the archaeological significance of the sites, and he certainly doesn't care about their spiritual importance. He'll bulldoze everything if it means building his casino. Grace Featherstone's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "And what do you propose to do about that? This Fletcher has lawyers and politicians in his pocket. He has permits and environmental studies and all the weapons that money can buy. What can one white man with a piece of paper do against all that?" Jake had been expecting this question and had spent sleepless nights trying to formulate an answer. That was both honest and hopeful. "I can't outspend him or outmaneuver him politically, but I can expose him. Fletcher's been lying about why he wants the land, hiding the existence of mineral deposits to avoid disclosure requirements. He's cut corners on environmental compliance in other projects. If we can get media attention on his illegal practices, if we can make this fight public, he might decide it's easier to find another location for his casino." Thomas Crow Dog laughed bitterly. "Media attention? You think reporters care about dead Indians and broken treaties? This is Nevada, not California. The newspapers here love development projects that bring in tax revenue and jobs. They'll paint Fletcher as a visionary and us as obstacles to progress." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged. "But Fletcher's success depends on his reputation with investors and regulators. If we can document his pattern of environmental violations, if we can prove he's been deliberately concealing the true value of the property, we might be able to generate enough legal trouble to make the project uneconomical." Another council member, an elderly man named Robert Standing Bear, spoke for the first time. "Young man, you're talking about warfare against someone who has been fighting and winning these battles since before you were born. Do you understand what you're volunteering for?" Jake thought about his time in Afghanistan, about missions where success had seemed impossible, but duty had demanded the attempt anyway. "I've fought unwinnable battles before. Sometimes you fight because it's right, not because you think you can win." The comparison seemed to resonate with Standing Bear, who nodded slowly. "A warrior's answer. But this is not a battlefield where courage alone determines victory. This is a legal and political war where your enemy has advantages you cannot overcome through individual heroism." "Then help me level the field," Jake said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "I know I can't do this alone. But if the tribe is willing to work with me, if we combine your legal rights as indigenous people with my property rights as the landowner, we might have enough leverage to stop Fletcher." Windwalker exchanged glances with the other council members, a silent communication that spoke of decades of shared struggle and hard-won wisdom about when to fight and when to negotiate. There are federal laws that protect sites of cultural and religious significance to Native American tribes, Windwalker said slowly. The National Historic Preservation Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. If we were to formally identify the sites in Millfield as culturally significant, it would trigger review processes that could delay or prevent development. But, Grace Featherstone added with obvious reluctance, it would also mean revealing the locations to federal archaeologists, potentially opening them to academic study tourism, and all the other forms of well-intentioned desecration that government protection often brings. Jake began to understand the impossible position the tribal council faced. They could protect the sacred sites by revealing them, but revelation itself would violate the sanctity they were trying to preserve. It was a choice between destruction by development and degradation by exposure, with no option that left the sites untouched and unknown. What if we could stop Fletcher without revealing the specific sites? Jake asked. What if we could make the entire area legally protected based on its potential to contain significant archaeological resources, without having to identify exactly what and where those resources are? Thomas Crow Dog shook his head impatiently. That's not how federal protection works. You need documented evidence of specific sites, formal designation through established processes. You can't just wave your hand and declare an area off limits to development. But Standing Bear was looking thoughtful, his weathered fingers drumming silently on the table as he considered Jake's suggestion. Actually, there might be a way. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act allows for emergency protective measures when sites are under imminent threat of damage. If we could document that Fletcher's geological surveys have already disturbed protected areas, we might be able to get an emergency injunction that would halt all development pending a full archaeological assessment. Jake felt his pulse quicken. With the first real hope he'd experienced since Fletcher's visit, how would we prove that his surveys caused damage? We'd need photographs, soil samples, evidence that his equipment disturbed areas containing archaeological materials, Windwalker replied. It would require access to the sites themselves, which means violating the secrecy that has protected them for 80 years. Maria spoke up for the first time since the formal presentations had begun. My grandfather taught me to recognize the signs of disturbance around the sacred places. If Fletcher's people have been up there with drilling equipment, I would be able to tell. The question is whether the council trusts me to document what needs to be documented without revealing more than necessary. The request hung in the air like a challenge, asking the tribal elders to extend their trust from one generation of the Santos family to the next, and to include Jake in that circle of confidence despite his recent arrival and questionable motives. You would be risking federal criminal charges if you're caught removing artifacts or interfering with an ongoing investigation, Grace Featherstone warned. The penalties for violating archaeological protection laws can include substantial prison time. The penalties for doing nothing include watching sacred places become casino parking lots, Maria replied with quiet determination. I'd rather face federal charges than explain to my husband's spirit why I let strangers destroy the places he helped me protect. Jake felt the conversation reaching a crucial decision point, understanding that what happened next would determine not just the strategy they pursued, but the fundamental nature of the alliance they were trying to build. The tribal council needed to decide whether to trust him with knowledge that could be used to betray them, while he needed to decide how much of his freedom and future he was willing to risk for people and places he'd known for less than a month. If we do this, Windwalker said slowly, it must be done according to our protocols, with respect for the spiritual as well as the legal aspects of what we're protecting. Mr. Thompson, are you prepared to accept guidance from people whose relationship to this land goes back thousands of years, even when that guidance conflicts with your instincts or preferences? The question went to the heart of Jake's character in ways that legal contracts or business negotiations never could. He was being asked to subordinate his judgment to that of people whose values and priorities were fundamentally different from his own, to trust their wisdom even when he couldn't fully understand their reasoning. Yes, Jake said simply. I'm prepared to follow your lead. The tribal council voted unanimously to support Jake's fight against Fletcher's development, but with conditions that reflected both their cultural values and their hard-earned skepticism about non-native allies. Jake would be granted access to general information about the protected sites, but specific locations would be revealed only on a need-to-know basis. Maria would serve as the primary liaison, documenting any damage Fletcher's surveys had caused while maintaining the secrecy that had protected the sites for decades. The tribe would provide legal support through their own attorneys, who specialized in federal laws protecting indigenous cultural resources. Most importantly, Jake would be required to transfer ownership of Millfield to a jointly controlled trust that included both tribal representatives and Maria's family, ensuring that no individual could make unilateral decisions about the land's future regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. The drive back to Millfield passed in contemplative silence, both Jake and Maria processing the magnitude of what they had committed themselves to undertaking. The alliance with the tribal council provided resources and legal expertise they desperately needed, but it also raised the stakes dramatically. They were no longer just fighting to preserve a ghost town. They were potentially standing between sacred sites and people who would destroy them for profit. "Are you having second thoughts?" Maria asked as they approached the town limits. Jake considered the question seriously, weighing his initial motivations for buying Millfield against the complex web of responsibilities he'd acquired since arriving. A month ago, he'd been a failed rancher looking for cheap land where he could lick his wounds in private. Now he was committed to a legal battle that could result in criminal charges, financial ruin, or both. "No," he said finally. "Whatever I thought I was buying when I paid that $105, what I actually got was the chance to be part of something that matters more than my personal problems. I'm not having second thoughts about that." Maria nodded with satisfaction. "Good, because tomorrow we start finding out exactly what Fletcher's people have been doing in those hills. And after that, there's no going back." That evening, Jake sat on the porch of the general store he'd been renovating, looking out over the town that had become the center of his universe. The buildings that had once seemed like empty shells waiting to be filled with his own ambitions now felt like monuments to the generations of people who had called this harsh place home. He could almost see them in the gathering dusk, the miners and their families, the shopkeepers and saloon owners, the children who had played in streets that now knew only wind and silence. Somewhere in the hills beyond the town, sites that had been sacred for millennia waited in the darkness, protected by an elderly Mexican-American woman's faithfulness to promises made by her grandfather, to people who had learned to survive by trusting carefully and rarely. Tomorrow, Jake would join the circle of guardians who had kept those promises, adding his commitment to theirs and hoping it would be enough to stand against the forces gathering to destroy everything they held sacred. The stars emerging overhead were the same ones that had watched over Millfield's birth, growth, decline, and unlikely resurrection. They had seen other battles between preservation and progress, other moments when ordinary people had been forced to choose between personal security and moral responsibility. Some of those battles had been won, others lost, but all had been worth fighting because they had defined what kind of people the fighters chose to be. Jake understood now that Fletcher's $2 million had never been the real choice confronting him. The real choice was whether to be the kind of person who protected things that mattered, or the kind who sold them for personal advantage. Having made that choice, he felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since losing his ranch, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with likely outcomes and everything to do with the alignment between his actions and his deepest values. 3 miles away, in a luxury hotel suite in Silver Ridge, Robert Fletcher was making phone calls that would determine how dirty the coming fight would become. Jake couldn't hear those conversations, couldn't anticipate the specific weapons Fletcher would deploy, but he was no longer intimidated by his opponent's resources or connections. He had something Fletcher couldn't buy or steal, the moral authority that came from fighting for others rather than himself, and the support of people whose claim to the land stretched back to the beginning of human memory. The battle for Millfield was about to begin in earnest, And for the first time since Fletcher's arrival, Jake felt ready for whatever came next. The evidence lay spread across the kitchen table in Maria's adobe house, like pieces of a puzzle that told a story of calculated destruction. Photographs showed fresh drill holes in areas where the earth had been undisturbed for centuries. Soil samples contained fragments of pottery and obsidian tools that had been churned up by Fletcher's geological surveys. Most damning of all were GPS coordinates that proved his exploration teams had worked directly over sites the tribal council had protected in secret for generations. Jake studied the documentation with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally found the weapons necessary to fight an unequal battle. 3 days of careful investigation with Maria and tribal archaeologist Dr. Sarah Crow Feather had produced enough evidence to support federal charges against Fletcher Development Corporation under multiple environmental protection statutes. This is more than sufficient to trigger an emergency injunction, Dr. Crow Feather confirmed, carefully sealing the soil samples in evidence containers that would preserve their chain of custody for court proceedings. Fletcher's teams have damaged at least 7 documented archaeological sites, some dating back over 2,000 years. The Department of the Interior will have no choice but to halt all development activities, pending a full investigation. Maria looked exhausted but grimly determined, her weathered hands steady as she organized the photographs they'd taken at considerable personal risk. Each image represented hours of careful documentation in areas she'd been taught never to disturb except in extreme circumstances. The weight of violating taboos that had guided her family for generations was visible in the lines around her eyes. "My grandfather would understand," she said quietly, as if reading Jake's thoughts. "He made his promise to protect these places from those who would desecrate them." Sometimes protection requires exposure of the threat itself. Jake felt the truth of her words settling in his chest, alongside a mixture of anticipation and dread. They had the evidence they needed to stop Fletcher's development, but using it would transform their quiet resistance into a very public battle with an opponent who had demonstrated his willingness to play dirty when faced with obstacles to his plans. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their planning session. Jake moved to the window and saw Sheriff Tom Bradley's patrol car, followed by 2 unmarked SUVs, their official license plates suggesting federal law enforcement. His stomach clenched with the sudden fear that Fletcher had somehow anticipated their investigation and arranged for them to be arrested before they could file their complaint. "Federal agents," Jake announced, his voice tight with apprehension. But when the vehicles stopped and their occupants emerged, Jake realized his fears had been misplaced. Tom Bradley approached the house with the expression of professional courtesy rather than hostile intent, followed by 2 agents whose business, attire and respectful demeanor suggested they were there to offer assistance rather than make arrests. "Jake, Maria," Tom called out. "These folks are from the FBI's Art Crime Team and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They'd like to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised regarding potential violations of federal archaeological protection laws." Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was a compact woman in her 40s whose intelligent eyes and careful movements suggested someone accustomed to handling volatile situations with patience and precision. Her partner, Agent Michael Runninghorse from the Bay, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood both federal law enforcement procedures and the cultural sensitivities surrounding sacred sites. Dr. Crow Feather contacted our office regarding potential damage to protected archaeological resources in this area, Agent Walsh explained as they settled around Maria's kitchen table. "We understand you've been documenting evidence of unauthorized disturbance to sites of cultural significance." Jake found himself in the surreal position of turning over evidence to federal agents, while sitting in the kitchen of a woman who had been living off the grid for decades. The incongruity of the moment struck him as perfectly representative of everything strange and unexpected about his life since buying Millfield. Fletcher Development Corporation has been conducting geological surveys without proper permits or archaeological oversight, Jake explained, handing over copies of the photographs and soil samples they'd prepared. Their equipment has damaged multiple sites containing artifacts that predate European settlement by centuries. Agent Running Horse examined the evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood its cultural as well as legal significance. These sites are on land owned by Mr. Thompson, but they contain resources that are protected under federal law, regardless of private property ownership. We've been working with the tribal council to document the extent of the damage and determine the best way to preserve what remains, Maria added. The Santos family has served as informal caretakers for these sites since the 1940s, under agreements with tribal elders that predate any federal legislation. Agent Walsh nodded approvingly. Cooperative relationships between private landowners and tribal communities are exactly what federal protection laws are designed to support. Mr. Thompson, your willingness to work with the tribal council rather than pursuing development that would destroy archaeological resources puts you in compliance with the spirit of these statutes, even if the formal procedures weren't followed initially. Jake felt a wave of relief that his cooperation with the tribal council was being viewed as legal compliance rather than potential obstruction of justice. The federal agent seemed genuinely committed to protecting the archaeological sites rather than simply following bureaucratic procedures that might inadvertently facilitate their destruction. What happens next? Jake asked. We immediately file for an emergency injunction, halting all development activities in the area pending completion of a comprehensive archaeological survey, Agent Walsh replied. Fletcher Development will be notified that they're under federal investigation for violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which carries criminal penalties, including substantial fines and potential imprisonment. They'll fight it, Jake warned. Fletcher has lawyers and political connections. He's not going to accept this without a battle. Agent Running Horse smiled grimly. Federal archaeological protection laws exist precisely because sites like these need protection from people with lawyers and political connections. The statutes are written to prioritize preservation over development, regardless of economic considerations or local political pressures. Over the following weeks, Jake watched the legal machinery of federal law enforcement grind into motion. With ponderous but inexorable efficiency, Fletcher Development Corporation found itself subjected to the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for major environmental crimes. With teams of archaeologists, federal agents, and tribal representatives documenting every aspect of the damage caused by their unauthorized surveys. The story broke in the Nevada press exactly as Fletcher had predicted, with initial coverage portraying him as a visionary developer being hampered by federal bureaucracy and archaeological technicalities. Editorial writers praised his plans to bring jobs and tax revenue to an economically depressed region, while dismissing the significance of a few old pottery shards found on otherwise worthless desert land. But Jake had learned something about modern media that Fletcher apparently hadn't anticipated. The story's frame could be changed by providing reporters with more compelling narratives and more dramatic evidence than the initial version offered. Working with Dr. Crowfeather and tribal historians, Jake helped coordinate media coverage that focused on the extraordinary archaeological richness of the Millfield area and the deliberate nature of Fletcher's violations. The revelation that Fletcher had concealed knowledge of mineral deposits while claiming the land was worthless added a dimension of corporate fraud that business reporters found irresistible. His pattern of environmental violations at other development projects provided context that transformed him from visionary entrepreneur to repeat offender whose current project represented escalation rather than aberration. Most damaging of all was the discovery that Fletcher had been conducting his geological surveys at night and on weekends, using equipment and personnel not listed on any of the environmental impact statements filed with state regulatory agencies. The systematic nature of his deception suggested criminal intent rather than mere regulatory oversight, elevating the investigation from civil enforcement to potential federal prosecution. Jake found himself at the center of a media storm that portrayed him as everything from environmental hero to property rights villain, depending on the political orientation of the publication covering the story. He gave interviews to reporters who seemed genuinely interested in understanding the archaeological and cultural significance of what they were protecting, while declining to speak with those who seemed more interested in manufacturing controversy than reporting facts. The most meaningful coverage came from Native American journalists who understood the broader context of the fight taking place at Millfield. Their articles connected Jake and Maria's resistance to a longer history of indigenous peoples defending sacred sites from exploitation by developers, miners, and government agencies that valued economic extraction over cultural preservation. "This isn't just about one ghost town or one casino," wrote journalist Amanda Blackhorse in Indian Country Today. "It's about whether sacred places have any protection in a society that treats land as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold." The alliance between Jake Thompson, Maria Santos, and tribal leaders represents the kind of partnership that could preserve indigenous cultural resources for future generations. Fletcher's response to the federal investigation was swift, comprehensive, and exactly as ruthless as Jake had anticipated. Within days of the injunction being filed, Jake found himself served with lawsuits alleging fraud, conspiracy, and interference with lawful business activities. Fletcher's legal team demanded damages in excess of $50 million, claiming that Jake's frivolous archaeological claims had destroyed the economic value of a legitimate development project. More ominously, Fletcher began using his political connections to pressure federal agencies to expedite their investigation and minimize the significance of their findings. Congressmen whose campaigns had benefited from Fletcher's contributions sent letters to the Department of the Interior, questioning the need for excessive archaeological protections that interfered with job-creating development projects. The pressure campaign extended beyond politics to personal intimidation tactics that reminded Jake uncomfortably of his military experience dealing with insurgents who used fear as a weapon against civilian populations. Surveyors appeared on the boundaries of Jake's property, taking photographs and measurements for unspecified purposes. Private investigators conducted background checks that extended to his ex-wife and daughter, seeking information that could be used to discredit his character or motivations. Most troubling were the anonymous phone calls and letters that suggested detailed surveillance of Jake's daily routines and social interactions. The messages never contained explicit threats, but their implications were clear. Fletcher had the resources to make life very difficult for anyone who continued to oppose his plans. "He's trying to isolate you," Sheriff Tom Bradley observed during one of his increasingly frequent visits to check on Jake and Maria's security. "Classic intimidation strategy. Make you feel like you're fighting alone, like the costs of resistance outweigh any possible benefits." Jake appreciated Tom's support, but he was finding it increasingly difficult to ignore the personal costs of his decision to fight Fletcher. The legal fees alone were consuming what remained of his savings, despite the pro bono assistance he was receiving from attorneys associated with the Tribal Council and environmental advocacy groups. The stress of constant litigation was affecting his sleep and his health in ways that reminded him of his worst periods in Afghanistan. More painful was the impact on his relationship with Emma, who had returned to California at her mother's insistence when the media attention around Millfield became intense and occasionally hostile. Sarah had made it clear that she viewed Jake's involvement in the archaeological protection battle as another example of his tendency to prioritize abstract principles over practical family considerations. "You're choosing strangers and dead Indians over your own daughter's welfare," Sarah had accused during a particularly bitter phone conversation. "Emma needs her father to be stable and present, not tilting at windmills in some Nevada wasteland." The accusation stung because it contained an uncomfortable element of truth. Jake's commitment to protecting the archaeological sites was requiring sacrifices that extended beyond his own comfort and security to affect people he loved more than any principle or cause. The moral complexity of that calculation kept him awake nights, questioning whether his fight was truly noble or simply another form of the selfishness that had contributed to his marriage's failure. It was Maria who provided the perspective that helped him navigate these doubts during their evening conversations on her small porch. Her decades of solitary dedication to preserving Millfield's memory had taught her to think in terms of generations rather than immediate consequences. "You're not fighting for strangers," she reminded him one evening as they watched the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed thousands of years of human struggle and survival. "You're fighting for your daughter's world, for the kind of place you want her to inherit. Emma may not understand that now, but someday she'd be proud that her father chose to protect something sacred instead of selling it for money." The wisdom in Maria's words was reinforced by an unexpected source of support that emerged as the federal investigation progressed. Dr. Sarah Crowfeather's archaeological survey had attracted the attention of academic institutions and cultural preservation organizations across the American West, creating a coalition of supporters who understood the broader implications of the Millfield case. Universities offered resources for conducting the comprehensive site documentation that federal law required. Museums provided expertise in artifact preservation and interpretation. Cultural organizations contributed legal support and media outreach that helped frame the story in terms of historical preservation rather than development obstruction. Most importantly, other Native American tribes with similar sacred site protection issues began citing the Millfield case as a precedent for their own legal battles with extractive industries and development corporations. Jake found himself inadvertently at the center of a movement that extended far beyond his personal conflict with Fletcher, connected to struggles taking place across the Intermountain West, wherever indigenous cultural resources faced threats from economic exploitation. The scope of this broader movement became clear during a gathering of tribal leaders, archaeologists, and activists at the reservation office where Jake had first met with the Shoshone-Paiute Council. Representatives from dozens of tribes shared stories of sacred sites that had been destroyed by mining, logging, and development projects, often with government approval and always with devastating cultural consequences for indigenous communities. "What you've accomplished here gives us all hope," explained Dr. Elizabeth Pretty Eagle, a Crow attorney who specialized in federal archaeological protection law. "The alliance you've built between property owners, tribal governments, and federal agencies provides a model that could be replicated wherever sacred sites need protection from commercial exploitation." Jake realized that his simple desire to start over in a cheap ghost town had evolved into something far more significant than he had ever imagined. The legal precedents being established through the Millfield case would affect sacred site protection efforts for generations, creating tools that indigenous communities could use to defend cultural resources that had survived for millennia but were increasingly threatened by modern development pressures. The turning point in the legal battle came 6 months after the initial federal injunction, when Fletcher Development Corporation's own internal documents were subpoenaed as part of the criminal investigation. The emails and reports revealed a pattern of deliberate deception that went far beyond simple regulatory violations to constitute systematic fraud against multiple government agencies. Fletcher's geological surveys had identified not only significant mineral deposits but also clear evidence of archaeological sites that would trigger federal protection requirements. Company emails showed that senior executives had made deliberate decisions to conceal both types of findings, believing they could complete land acquisition before their legal obligations became apparent to regulatory authorities. More damaging still were communications between Fletcher and political supporters, that revealed efforts to manipulate the regulatory process through campaign contributions and personal favors. The conspiracy extended to county officials who had fast-tracked the sale of Millfield to Jake while concealing Fletcher's interest in acquiring the same property through more expensive but less scrutinized channels. This isn't just archaeological protection law violation anymore, Agent Walsh explained during a briefing that included Jake, Maria, and tribal representatives. We're looking at mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to violate federal environmental protection statutes, and potential RICO violations if we can establish that Fletcher Development operated as a criminal enterprise. The escalation from civil enforcement to criminal prosecution fundamentally altered the dynamics of Jake's conflict with Fletcher. Instead of being portrayed as environmental activists obstructing legitimate development, Jake and his allies were now cooperating witnesses in a federal criminal investigation of corporate fraud and political corruption. Fletcher's response to the criminal charges was to offer Jake a settlement that would have resolved all civil litigation in exchange for his agreement not to cooperate further with federal prosecutors. The proposed payment was $25 million, enough money to secure not just Jake's financial future, but Emma's education and Sarah's retirement as well. It's more money than you could spend in several lifetimes, Fletcher's attorney explained during a settlement conference that Jake attended with legal counsel provided by the Tribal Coalition. Mr. Fletcher recognizes that this situation has spiraled beyond its original scope. He's prepared to pay generously to resolve all outstanding issues and allow everyone to move forward with their lives. The offer was structured to make acceptance almost irresistible, with payments that would begin immediately and continue for 20 years. Providing Jake with financial security far beyond anything he had lost when his Montana ranch was foreclosed. All he had to do was walk away from the archaeological sites and allow Fletcher to proceed with a modified development plan that claimed to respect cultural resources while actually destroying them through incremental encroachment. Jake asked for time to consider the offer, though he already knew what his answer would be. The money was tempting, especially when he thought about Emma's college expenses and the financial stress his legal battle had created for everyone who cared about him. But accepting Fletcher's settlement would mean abandoning Maria, betraying the trust of tribal leaders who had treated him as an equal partner, and allowing sacred sites to be destroyed for the same commercial motives that had driven exploitation of indigenous resources for centuries. More fundamentally, accepting the settlement would make Jake complicit in the kind of moral compromise that had contributed to his original failures in Montana. He had lost his ranch partly because he had trusted people whose word proved worthless when tested by financial pressure. Now he was being asked to become the kind of person who abandoned principles when offered sufficient incentive to do so. "I can't take the money," Jake informed Fletcher's attorney the following day. "I made commitments to people who trusted me with something they've been protecting for generations. Those commitments aren't for sale." The rejection of Fletcher's settlement offer marked the beginning of the final phase of their conflict, as Fletcher abandoned any pretense of legal or ethical behavior in favor of tactics designed to destroy Jake's credibility and resolve through personal destruction. Private investigators began following Emma at her school in California, creating safety concerns that forced Sarah to hire private security and consider relocating to another state. Burglaries at Jake's property damaged equipment and supplies while avoiding items valuable enough to suggest simple theft. The pattern of harassment was sophisticated enough to avoid clear criminal liability, while creating constant stress and uncertainty about what might happen next. The intimidation campaign escalated when Maria's adobe house was broken into during one of her trips to visit her husband's grave in the Millfield cemetery. Nothing was stolen, but the intruders had gone through her personal papers and photographs with sufficient thoroughness to send a clear message about the extent of their surveillance capabilities. "They're looking for something they can use against us," Maria observed with the calm resignation of someone who had survived decades of hardship and wasn't easily intimidated by wealthy bullies. They think if they can find evidence of wrongdoing or weakness, they can force us to abandon what we're protecting. Fletcher's aggressive tactics backfired badly. Instead of silencing Jake and Maria, he generated public sympathy for them and handed federal investigators evidence of witness intimidation, leading to additional charges of obstruction of justice. His harassment campaign also drew unwanted media attention, painting him as a corrupt corporate figure, bullying ordinary citizens trying to protect archaeological treasures. The real turning point came not from law enforcement, but from Fletcher's own investors. As legal costs and delays mounted, investors started demanding answers. The federal investigation had stalled permitting and financing for the casino project, while legal fees and damage control were burning through resources with no returns in sight. When the largest investor, a pension fund for Nevada state employees, pulled out citing ethical concerns, the entire project unraveled. Other investors quickly followed, leaving Fletcher personally responsible for debts he couldn't cover without selling off assets from other ventures. Ultimately, Fletcher accepted a plea deal. He agreed to abandon all plans for development in the Millfield area and admitted guilt for violating archaeological protection laws. He received an 18-month federal prison sentence and was ordered to pay for restoration and preservation efforts. Most importantly for Jake and Maria, the plea included a formal acknowledgement of the area's archaeological and cultural significance. This admission laid the groundwork for federal designation of Millfield as a National Historic Landmark, ensuring permanent protection from future development. The victory was celebrated in Maria's adobe home, with tribal representatives joining Jake and Maria to mark the end of a nearly 2-year battle. The event was both joyful and reflective, honoring their win while recognizing the ongoing challenges indigenous communities face in protecting cultural heritage. "This is what partnership looks like," said Joseph Windwalker during the informal ceremony. "Not just individuals working together, but entire communities united by shared values about our relationship with the land." Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from bankruptcy and divorce in Montana to this moment of shared purpose in Nevada. The ghost town he bought for $105 had given him something far more valuable than money: real friendships, meaningful purpose, and the chance to help preserve history for future generations. 5 years after Fletcher's conviction, Jake stood on the porch of the visitor center he and Maria had built, welcoming thousands of visitors each year, eager to learn about Millfield's history and preserved sites. The town itself remained unchanged, its buildings maintained as historical relics, but the surrounding area had become a hub for students and researchers studying ancient indigenous cultures. Maria, now in her 80s, was still the heart of the project, serving as its lead historical interpreter. Her deep knowledge and ancestral role as caretaker made her a vital link between academia and tradition. Universities competed to send students to study under her, knowing that what she taught couldn't be found in books. The Millfield Research Center had become a national model for culturally respectful archaeology. Its management, shared between tribal leaders, scholars, and community members, was now being emulated at other sites facing similar threats. Jake had gone from ghost town owner to program director, running educational initiatives that connected Native American students with global researchers. His daughter Emma, now a college student studying environmental law, spent her summers working at the site, continuing the mission that had once strained her parents' relationship. Millfield's success had given Jake financial stability far beyond what he'd lost in Montana, but more importantly, it had given him belonging and purpose. His transformation also helped mend his relationship with his ex-wife Sarah. She gradually came to see that Jake's commitment to preservation was not an act of stubbornness, but a sign of growth. The ghost town purchase, once seen as reckless, was now clearly the turning point in Jake's life. "You saved us," Maria often told Jake during their sunset chats on her porch. "Not just me and the land, but yourself too. You stopped running and became who you were meant to be." Jake knew she was right. His past failures had been necessary to clear a path toward his true calling. Millfield had taught him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought. They had to be earned through service to something greater than oneself. With Maria's help, Jake had helped turn a forgotten desert town into a beacon of cultural preservation. The sacred sites her family had secretly protected for generations were now federally safeguarded and celebrated by scholars worldwide. Most importantly, Jake had learned that home wasn't something you purchased. It was something you built through trust, service, and connection. Millfield became his home not because he owned it, but because he had earned his place in the community that had guarded it for generations. As night fell over the desert, Jake felt the quiet fulfillment of someone who had found their purpose. The stars above were the same ones that had watched over the region's earliest inhabitants. Settlers, miners, and now protectors. Tomorrow would bring more challenges and new students, but for tonight, Jake sat in peace, grateful that a $105 ghost town had brought him more meaning than he'd ever dreamed possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.